It was a bright morning and the city was already alive with its usual noise. Cars honked impatiently at traffic lights, street vendors called out to sell their wares, and people moved hurriedly along the sidewalks, rushing to their work, appointments, or errands. In the midst of this ordinary bustle, one man walked with a calm, purposeful stride. He carried himself with quiet authority, yet there was no hint of arrogance in the way he moved. Though dressed in plain clothes, there was a sense of respect around him, something people noticed without fully understanding why. He was an Army lieutenant general, visiting the city for an official inspection. But at that moment he was just another man navigating the busy streets. He had just finished a meeting at a government office and was heading to a nearby venue where he would review local defense facilities. He walked slowly, observing the city's life, taking in the sounds and sights, but also keeping an alert eye on his surroundings. Security was minimal because he often moved this way, preferring to blend in and observe the reality of situations, on the ground rather than hiding behind walls or entourages. He believed in experiencing things as they were, seeing people as they were, and handling problems with patience and calm. It was a method that had served him well for decades, teaching him that leadership was not only about command, but also about understanding and control. As he approached a busy intersection, he noticed a police checkpoint. Officers were stopping cars, checking IDs, and directing traffic. It seemed routine, and he did not expect any trouble. Yet as he stepped closer, one officer's gaze fell sharply on him, and something in the man's demeanor shifted. The officer, wearing a standard uniform but with a certain stiffness in his movements, began to call out, "You! Stop there!" he barked, pointing at the lieutenant general with a commanding tone that left little room for explanation. The lieutenant general paused, raised his hand slightly, and approached carefully. "Good morning," he said calmly. "Is there a problem?" His voice was steady, polite, and even, but it carried an unshakable sense of authority. The officer, however, seemed to ignore that. He stepped closer, his face tense, and his hand moved toward his holstered weapon. "ID, papers. What do you think you're doing here?" the officer demanded, his voice rising. He looked around as if daring anyone to challenge him. His fellow officers stood nearby, some uneasy, some unsure how to react. It was clear that the situation was escalating, and what should have been a routine check was turning into something volatile. The lieutenant general reached into his coat, not to show fear but to produce identification calmly. He handed it over slowly, giving the officer a chance to see the credentials without feeling threatened. The officer glanced at the ID and paused for a moment. Then, as if realizing that the man before him held higher authority, he sneered. "Don't think you're special just because of your title," he muttered under his breath, loud enough for nearby pedestrians to hear. People passing by slowed down, sensing tension in the air. Some pulled out their phones, quietly recording what was happening. There was a mixture of fear and curiosity. Nobody wanted trouble, but everyone instinctively knew that something unusual was unfolding. The officer's tone grew more aggressive. He took a step forward, ignoring protocol and the other officers, and pointed his gun directly at the lieutenant general. Time seemed to slow. The crowd froze. A mother pulled her child closer, and a street vendor stopped mid-sentence, watching the confrontation unfold. The officer's actions were shocking. Pointing a gun at someone, making racial insults, and ignoring standard procedure was not just inappropriate, it was dangerous. The lieutenant general did not flinch. He remained calm, his face composed, his hands visible. He understood the gravity of the situation, but he also knew that reacting with anger or sudden movement could make things worse. "Lower your weapon," he said quietly but firmly. His voice did not shout. It did not plead, but it carried the weight of experience. "There is no need for this. Let us handle this properly." The officer, fueled by anger and prejudice, ignored the command and continued with his insults, muttering words that reflected deep-seated bias and disrespect. Nearby officers finally stepped in, sensing the potential for disaster. One placed a hand on the aggressive officer's shoulder. Another gently tried to position himself between the gun and the lieutenant general. The crowd remained silent, but tense, watching as the situation teetered on the edge. It was a moment where anyone could misstep, where fear could turn into tragedy. The lieutenant general remained unshaken. He spoke again, this time addressing the officer directly. "You are accountable for your actions. You are putting yourself and others at risk. Step back and follow the rules." His tone was calm, but there was no mistaking the authority behind it. He was not threatening. He was stating facts, presenting logic that was hard to ignore. Finally, the officer's hand wavered slightly. Another officer whispered something, and the aggressive officer slowly lowered his weapon, still muttering under his breath, but no longer pointing the gun. The crowd exhaled collectively, tension breaking slightly. People who had been holding their breath began to murmur among themselves, discussing what they had just witnessed. Even though the immediate threat was contained, the lieutenant general remained cautious. He thanked the other officers for stepping in and kept a watchful eye on the aggressive man. He knew that this situation was serious, not just because of the immediate danger, but because it revealed something deeper: prejudice, lack of discipline, and the potential for abuse of power. The incident did not go unnoticed. Some bystanders approached, quietly asking if he was all right, offering support, and expressing shock at what had happened. The lieutenant general spoke to them kindly, explaining that he was fine and that the important thing now was to ensure proper action was taken. He emphasized the need for calm, for clear reporting, and for justice. As the lieutenant general walked away from the scene, the crowd's attention remained on the officers, some whispering about the recklessness, others questioning how such behavior could happen in the first place. Social media posts began appearing almost immediately, people uploading short clips and recounting the incident in real time. The reach of technology meant that what happened at that checkpoint would be known far beyond the city streets, spreading awareness and calling attention to misconduct. This moment, though terrifying, also highlighted character. The lieutenant general had handled the confrontation with dignity and courage, refusing to escalate, refusing to respond to hatred with anger. It was a lesson in patience, discipline, and leadership. The aggressive officer, on the other hand, had exposed the dangers of prejudice, impulsivity, and misuse of authority. By the time the lieutenant general reached his destination, the incident had already sparked conversations among the local community, the police department, and news outlets. People were discussing how a routine day could turn into a dangerous confrontation, how accountability was essential, and how courage and composure could prevent worse outcomes. For the lieutenant general, the morning was a reminder that leadership was not only about giving orders or inspecting facilities. It was about understanding human behavior, managing conflict, and showing integrity when others fail to do so. And though the threat had passed, he knew that this incident would not simply disappear. It would need to be addressed, investigated, and resolved properly. What had begun as a simple walk through a busy street had turned into a test of patience, courage, and professionalism. Every person who witnessed it would remember the tension, the fear, and the calm strength of a man who refused to let prejudice dictate the outcome. And in those moments, the city itself seemed to pause, witnessing an event that would ripple far beyond that ordinary morning, a story of bravery, integrity, and the urgent need for accountability. The city streets slowly began to return to their usual rhythm, but the memory of the incident at the checkpoint lingered in the minds of everyone who had witnessed it. Passers-by whispered to each other about the man in plain clothes who had stood calmly while a police officer had pointed a gun at him. Many of them had never seen anything like it, and the story was spreading quickly from mouth to mouth as well as online. Videos taken by onlookers had already started circulating on social media. Short clips of the tense moments with the officer's aggressive tone and the lieutenant general's calm composure were shared hundreds of times within minutes. Comments poured in. Shock, anger, and admiration mixed together as people tried to make sense of what had happened. Meanwhile, the lieutenant general continued his visit to the local government facility. He moved carefully, fully aware that what had just happened might follow him in more ways than one. Even though he remained composed, there was a part of him that understood the gravity of the situation. This was not merely a personal threat. It was an exposure of deeper issues: bias, aggression, and a failure of judgment within law enforcement. He knew that this moment could spark change. but only if handled correctly. Inside the facility, he was met by local officials who were visibly nervous. News of the incident had reached them even before he arrived, and they seemed unsure how to respond. They welcomed him respectfully, but their eyes occasionally darted to the window where the city outside continued its life, oblivious to the tension that had taken place just a short while ago. The lieutenant general, sensing their unease, tried to put them at ease. He spoke softly but firmly about the importance of transparency, accountability, and calm leadership. "We handle challenges not with anger," he said, "but with patience, facts, and integrity. That is how respect is earned, and that is how change is possible." Back at the checkpoint, the police officers involved were still processing what had just occurred. Some were ashamed, some confused, and some frustrated that a routine procedure had escalated into a near crisis. The officer who had pointed the gun was seething quietly, muttering to himself, but no one dared approach him. A senior officer arrived on the scene shortly after, having been alerted by the initial call. He immediately assessed the situation. Body language, expressions, and the tension lingering in the air all suggested that something serious had happened. The senior officer called for reports from the witnesses and reviewed the footage that had been captured by bystanders' phones. Within minutes, it became clear that the situation was beyond a minor misunderstanding. The senior officer spoke with the man who had caused the problem, questioning his actions. "Why did you point your weapon?" he asked calmly but firmly. The officer fidgeted, his pride clashing with the undeniable facts of the recordings and eyewitness statements. He stammered at first, then grew defensive, muttering excuses that revealed fear more than reason. The other officers who had witnessed the event explained what they had seen, emphasizing the recklessness and the inappropriate remarks that had been made. The scene was tense, but order was slowly restored as the senior officer asserted control. Meanwhile, the lieutenant general's staff had already started coordinating with law enforcement headquarters. They were making calls, sending messages, and ensuring that the incident was properly documented. He himself did not involve himself in the bureaucracy, preferring to focus on the immediate tasks of his visit, but he followed every report closely. His calm and measured approach became a model for others around him. While some officials panicked or wanted to react emotionally, he remained focused on what mattered: accountability, safety, and the integrity of the process. In the hours that followed, more people came forward. Witnesses who had initially hesitated to speak were now eager to explain what they had seen. Store owners, street vendors, and even pedestrians who had been recording on their phones gave detailed accounts. The clips circulating online captured brief moments of the confrontation, but human memory filled in the rest: the gestures, the tone, the fear, and the courage that had been displayed. Each account added layers to the story, creating a fuller picture of the event that no single camera angle could capture. The media quickly picked up on the incident. Local news channels ran short segments, showing clips of the officer pointing the weapon and the calm demeanor of the man he threatened. Social media exploded with reactions. Some expressed outrage at the officer's behavior, condemning the abuse of power and racism. Others expressed admiration for the lieutenant general, noting how composed he remained under threat. The incident became a point of discussion not just for law enforcement issues, but for society as a whole: how prejudice and aggression could intersect with authority, and how courage and composure could counter fear. The lieutenant general, though aware of the growing attention, remained unshaken. He continued his visits, checking facilities, speaking with staff, and observing operations. Yet at every opportunity, he reminded his team to keep detailed records of the incident. Documentation was crucial, not for revenge, not for punishment alone, but to ensure that lessons could be learned and that accountability would be enforced. His staff took notes, filed reports, and maintained a calm but thorough approach. This was leadership in action, focused on results and truth rather than drama or spectacle. Back at the police department, the internal review process was underway. Senior officials held meetings, reviewing protocols, policies, and the actions of each officer involved. The officer who had caused the incident was placed on immediate administrative leave, while the investigation continued. It was a necessary step to ensure public trust and to show that no one was above accountability. Officers who had witnessed the event were interviewed in detail, and body cam footage, along with the videos from bystanders, was carefully analyzed. The department made clear statements about their commitment to fairness and to addressing misconduct swiftly. Even as the day went on, the city felt the ripple effects of the incident. Citizens discussed what had happened with friends and family, debating the importance of law enforcement ethics, racial sensitivity, and professional responsibility. Some feared that the situation could have turned violent, while others praised the calm and strategic response of the lieutenant general. Social media conversations continued, with hashtags emerging that highlighted both the problem of prejudice and the importance of integrity. Through it all, the lieutenant general remained focused on human connection. He spoke with local staff, facility managers, and community members, asking questions, listening to concerns, and offering guidance. He emphasized that the incident was not just about the actions of one officer, but about the broader responsibility of all individuals to act with fairness and respect. His message was clear: courage alone is not enough. Careful action, awareness, and ethical behavior are what make a difference. By late afternoon, the initial shock had subsided, but the impact of the event was far from over. The officer who had pointed the gun was being formally investigated, and plans for disciplinary action were being discussed. The department had mobilized resources to ensure that proper steps were taken, and senior leadership made public statements emphasizing that misconduct, especially acts fueled by prejudice, would not be tolerated. The story had become not just a local concern, but a symbol of the importance of accountability, fairness, and courage in the face of danger. For the lieutenant general, the day ended with reflection. He understood that public attention was inevitable, and that people would have opinions both supportive and critical. What mattered most to him, however, was that the truth was clear, the process was transparent, and the lesson was being learned. His calm demeanor had prevented a dangerous escalation, and his insistence on proper documentation and reporting ensured that justice could follow. He returned to his temporary residence that evening, thinking not about personal credit, but about the next steps, how to ensure that this incident would lead to meaningful change, both within the police force and in the broader community. At the end of the day, the city slept, but the story remained alive. Videos continued to circulate, discussions continued online and offline, and officials worked to ensure that the lessons of the day would not be forgotten. The lieutenant general's composure under threat became a point of study for leadership courses, training programs, and public discussions. The incident, though unsettling, had become an opportunity for growth, reflection, and improvement, a reminder that even in moments of fear and confrontation, calm, courage, and integrity could make all the difference. And as the city prepared for another day, the memory of that morning at the checkpoint lingered, a lesson etched in the minds of everyone who had witnessed it, a reminder that human behavior could be both dangerous and extraordinary, and that one person's courage could inspire many to act with integrity. Even though the immediate threat had passed, the tension from the morning's incident remained heavy in the air. The city had returned to its usual rhythm, but for those who had witnessed what had happened at the checkpoint, the images and sounds lingered vividly. The officer's aggressive stance, the gun pointed with careless arrogance, the harsh words, it all seemed surreal. Yet it had happened, and it could not be ignored. Inside the police department, the situation was being handled with increasing urgency. Senior officers had gathered, reviewing the footage that had circulated online and the body cam videos captured during the encounter. Each frame told the same story. A high-ranking Army officer had been threatened unnecessarily, and the aggressive police officer had acted without regard for procedure, safety, or human decency. The senior officials understood immediately that this was not a situation to be swept under the rug. It required swift and decisive action. The officer who had caused the chaos was now in a small, stark room in the department, seated across from a senior supervisor. His posture was tense, his eyes darting from side to side. He had been told to remain calm, to explain himself, and to answer questions truthfully. But calm was not his natural state. Anger, embarrassment, and defensiveness wrestled with each other inside him. He spoke quickly, trying to justify his actions. I thought he was... I just didn't know. His voice trailed off, the excuses sounding hollow even to his own ears. The senior officer listened quietly. There was no yelling, no displays of authority meant to intimidate. Instead, there was a controlled, steady presence that communicated seriousness without unnecessary aggression. "You pointed a weapon at someone without cause," the supervisor said slowly. "You insulted him with words that were unacceptable, unprofessional, and offensive. You endangered not only your life but also the lives of others. Can you explain why this happened?" The officer fidgeted in his chair, the weight of reality pressing down on him. He knew the footage existed, that witnesses had recorded everything, and that his excuses would hold little credibility. He muttered something incoherent about following instincts, but the supervisor cut him off. "Instinct does not excuse misconduct. Protocol exists for a reason. You failed in your duties, and your actions are being taken very seriously." Meanwhile, other officers who had witnessed the event were speaking with investigators. They described what they had seen, how the officer had escalated unnecessarily, how he had ignored commands from senior staff, and how he had displayed clear bias in his remarks. Some spoke hesitantly, unsure if speaking out would make them targets for criticism, while others were resolute, wanting to ensure the truth was known. Every account added clarity to the story, revealing a pattern of recklessness that could not be ignored. As the investigation continued, the lieutenant general was informed in detail about the steps being taken. He was calm but vigilant, asking questions to ensure that the process would be fair and thorough. "It is not enough to punish one person," he said. "We must understand how this could happen and ensure it does not happen again. Systems, training, and awareness need to be part of the solution." His words were measured, emphasizing reform rather than revenge, accountability rather than anger. Outside the department, the city was abuzz. Videos continued to circulate, showing the tense moments of the morning. The public was shocked and outraged, sharing their thoughts in comments, posts, and conversations. Many expressed relief that no one had been hurt, while others focused on the deeper issues: prejudice, abuse of power, and the need for professional conduct. Local news stations ran multiple segments, interviewing experts on law enforcement ethics, public safety, and racial sensitivity. It became clear that the incident would not be forgotten quickly. Back at the checkpoint, the scene had been restored to normal operation, but traces of the morning's chaos lingered. The cones, the tape, and the signs of heightened tension remained as reminders. Officers who had been present were visibly affected, some glancing at each other in silent acknowledgement of how dangerous the situation had become. Training sessions were scheduled immediately, emphasizing the importance of calm judgment, proper procedure, and awareness of personal biases. It was a moment of learning, a rare but critical opportunity for growth. The officer under investigation, now alone in the quiet room, began to feel the full weight of the consequences. He realized that the recordings, eyewitness accounts, and official statements formed an undeniable record. There was no way to escape responsibility. The senior supervisor spoke again, this time emphasizing not only the immediate consequences but also the larger picture. "Your actions do not exist in isolation. They affect trust, safety, and the reputation of this entire department. Understanding that is part of what accountability means." While the internal investigation proceeded, the lieutenant general continued his official duties. He visited other facilities, spoke with local staff, and observed procedures with a critical but fair eye. He met people who were dedicated, hardworking, and committed, but he also noticed areas where improvements were needed. Every interaction reinforced his belief that leadership required not only authority, but empathy, understanding, and constant vigilance. He took the lessons of the morning with him, quietly applying them in his decisions, conversations, and observations. In the community, the story sparked conversations among people from all walks of life. Social gatherings, local businesses, and schools became spaces for discussion. People debated the role of law enforcement, the dangers of prejudice, and the importance of integrity in positions of authority. Some spoke passionately about how easily things could have turned violent, while others praised the calm response of the lieutenant general, using his example to teach lessons about courage and patience. The incident became more than a news story. It became a learning moment for society at large. At the police department, senior leadership convened meetings to determine the next steps. The officer would face formal disciplinary action, and measures were taken to ensure he would not endanger others again. Meanwhile, Additional training sessions were organized for all personnel, emphasizing not only technical skills but also ethical behavior, communication, and emotional intelligence. The incident was analyzed in detail, from the initial encounter to the responses of bystanders and supervisors, to identify every point where intervention could have prevented escalation. Even as the day turned into evening, the officer under investigation sat quietly, reflecting on his choices. He realized that one moment of recklessness had set off a chain of events that would alter his career, reputation, and the way people perceived him. The weight of his actions pressed heavily on him. There was shame, fear, and regret, but also a lesson that he could not escape. Actions have consequences, and integrity cannot be ignored. The Lieutenant General, meanwhile, took a moment of quiet reflection. He understood that incidents like this were part of a larger challenge, building systems where respect, fairness, and accountability were central. He spoke to his aides about the importance of using this incident as an example, not for punishment alone, but for education and reform. "We cannot change what happened," he said, "but we can ensure it does not happen again." That is how leadership works. That is how trust is built. As night fell over the city, the social media posts, news stories, and personal conversations continued. The incident had left a mark, not only on those directly involved, but on the broader community. People were thinking about safety, fairness, and the courage to stand up for what is right. The story was being shared widely, prompting reflection, discussion, and sometimes heated debate. Yet at the heart of it, the message was clear: calm, integrity, and accountability are powerful tools, even when faced with aggression and prejudice. By the end of the day, the initial shock had transformed into purposeful action. Officers involved were being retrained, procedures were being reinforced, and the officer who had caused the incident faced clear consequences. Witnesses continued to provide detailed statements, and senior officials documented every aspect of the event. Meanwhile, the Lieutenant General's composed leadership remained a benchmark, showing that courage combined with patience and clear thinking could guide everyone through even the most tense situations. The story of that morning became a teaching moment, one that would be referenced in discussions about law enforcement, public safety, and leadership. Videos, first-hand accounts, and official reports all painted a vivid picture of how quickly things could escalate, how prejudice could endanger lives, and how composure could prevent disaster. The community learned that the actions of one individual, whether positive or negative, could ripple through society, influencing perceptions, behaviors, and trust. And even though the city moved forward with its everyday life, the traffic, the markets, the routine of daily work, the memory of the incident remained alive in the minds of those who had witnessed it. It was a moment of tension, courage, and reflection, a reminder that human behavior can both challenge and inspire, and that integrity, patience, and accountability are more than words. They are actions that define character and shape the future. The day after the incident, the city felt different. It wasn't that anything had changed on the surface. The streets were still busy, cars still honked, and people moved through their routines. But for many, the memory of what had happened lingered. Conversations on street corners, in cafes, and in offices revolved around the confrontation at the checkpoint. The video clips circulating online had made it impossible for the incident to be ignored. People were talking not just about what had happened, but about why it had happened, and what it meant for trust, safety, and accountability. At the police department, the atmosphere was tense and focused. Senior leadership had immediately escalated the case to the highest internal review boards. Meetings were held in rapid succession, carefully analyzing every detail. Officers were asked to provide detailed accounts of what they had seen, heard, and done. The department wanted a full understanding of the situation, from the actions of the aggressive officer to the response of those who intervened. It was a thorough and deliberate process, designed to ensure that nothing was overlooked and that justice could be served. The officer who had pointed his weapon at the Lieutenant General was now fully under investigation. He sat in a quiet room, aware that his career, reputation, and credibility were all on the line. The weight of his actions had begun to sink in. He realized that his impulsive behavior had endangered not only the man in front of him, but also the trust of the public and his fellow officers. He had crossed a line, one that could not be ignored. Every detail was being examined: his words, his movements, his attitude, and the choices he had made in the heat of the moment. Meanwhile, the lieutenant general continued with his official duties, but his mind was partly focused on the events from the previous day. He understood that what had happened was not just an isolated incident. It was a reflection of deeper issues that needed to be addressed. He worked with his aides to ensure that the event was fully documented, that reports were accurate, and that there would be accountability. His approach was careful, measured, and intentional. He knew that fairness and transparency were essential if lessons were to be learned and improvements made. At the same time, the media continued to cover the story. News outlets ran detailed segments showing clips of the confrontation, interviews with witnesses, and expert analysis of what had occurred. Social media platforms were filled with posts discussing the incident. Some users expressed outrage at the officer's actions, condemning the abuse of authority and the racial undertones of his words. Others praised the lieutenant general's calm and professional handling of the situation. The story had grown beyond a single event to become a discussion about ethics, leadership, and accountability in law enforcement. Inside the department, senior officers were making decisions with care. The aggressive officer was placed on immediate suspension pending a full review. He was informed that his actions were unacceptable and that formal disciplinary measures would be taken. At the same time, the department focused on broader reforms. Training programs were reviewed, procedures were reinforced, and officers were reminded of their responsibilities to act professionally and ethically. The goal was not only to address one incident, but to prevent future occurrences and restore trust within the community. Witnesses who had captured the event on their phones were contacted by investigators. They provided detailed accounts of what they had seen and heard, adding depth to the video evidence. Their statements helped clarify the timeline, the behavior of the aggressive officer, and the composure of the lieutenant general. These accounts painted a clear picture of the events and allowed investigators to understand how and why the situation had escalated. For the witnesses, it was a moment of responsibility. They had been bystanders, but their actions in documenting the incident now played a key role in ensuring accountability. The lieutenant general's calm and deliberate approach continued to influence those around him. In meetings, he emphasized the importance of acting ethically, of remaining composed under pressure, and of always documenting events accurately. He spoke about the responsibility of leadership and the need for integrity in every decision. His message was simple but powerful. Courage alone is not enough. True leadership requires careful thought, ethical action, and the ability to guide others through challenging situations without letting fear or anger take control. Outside the department, the city remained engaged with the story. People shared their opinions, debated what should happen, and reflected on the larger implications. Some discussed the dangers of unchecked authority, while others focused on the lessons about courage and composure. Community groups held meetings to talk about accountability, respect, and fairness. Local schools and civic organizations even used the incident as a teaching moment, emphasizing the importance of ethics, responsibility, and courage. It became a broader lesson for the city, a story that touched the lives of many beyond the immediate event. The officer under investigation, isolated in his quiet room, had plenty of time to think. The initial rush of anger, fear, and defensiveness had faded, leaving only reflection and the harsh reality of consequences. He realized that his actions had not only endangered someone's life, but had also damaged trust in the department and harmed his own reputation. He began to understand that true professionalism meant more than following orders. It meant acting with integrity, fairness, and awareness at all times. It was a hard lesson, but one he could not ignore. Meanwhile, the lieutenant general reviewed the reports, analyzed the footage, and coordinated with his aides and local authorities. He wanted to ensure that the story was recorded accurately, that the incident would not be used to mislead the public, and that meaningful change could occur. He focused on both the immediate situation and the broader implications. The incident was a reminder that leadership was not just about power, rank, or authority. It was about responsibility, accountability, and guiding others with clarity and fairness. By the afternoon, formal steps were being taken. The department issued statements reaffirming its commitment to accountability, transparency, and ethical behavior. The officer under investigation was informed of the next steps, including hearings and potential termination. At the same time, all officers were reminded of their responsibilities to act professionally and to prevent situations from escalating. Training sessions were planned to reinforce ethical conduct, conflict resolution, and bias awareness. The goal was not just to punish, but to ensure that the entire organization learned from the incident. The Lieutenant General also took time to engage with local officials and community leaders. He discussed how the event could be used to strengthen trust between law enforcement and the public. He spoke about the importance of systems, oversight, and ethical culture. His message was consistent. Accountability is essential, courage must be guided by integrity, and leadership requires continuous attention to fairness and ethical action. As evening approached, the city reflected on the morning's confrontation and the following investigation. People were discussing it in homes, workplaces, and online spaces. The story had evolved from a tense encounter to a larger conversation about responsibility, ethics, and public trust. Citizens debated what steps should be taken, how organizations could prevent similar incidents, and the importance of leaders who acted with composure and fairness. It had become a moment of learning for the city, one that went far beyond the immediate individuals involved. The officer, still alone, was left with the weight of reflection. He considered how quickly events had spiraled, how one poor choice had consequences far beyond what he had imagined. He realized that integrity, awareness, and respect were not optional. They were essential. His career, reputation, and credibility were now at stake, and he understood that his actions could no longer be justified or ignored. It was a moment of reckoning, one that would shape his future profoundly. The Lieutenant General, on the other hand, remained steady and focused. He understood that incidents like this were not just isolated events. They were opportunities to reinforce principles, teach lessons, and create lasting change. He continued his visits, his meetings, and his observations with an eye toward fairness, accountability, and ethical leadership. Every step he took emphasized that courage paired with composure and ethical action could prevent disaster and inspire others. By nightfall, the investigation had established a clear narrative. The officer's misconduct was undeniable. The intervention of other officers had prevented a worse outcome, and the Lieutenant General's calm and professional handling had prevented escalation. The city had absorbed the story, learned from it, and begun conversations about ethics, integrity, and responsibility. Social media continued to buzz. News outlets summarized the findings, and citizens discussed what it meant for public trust and leadership. In the quiet of his office, the Lieutenant General reflected on the events. He knew that one incident, though intense, could leave lasting lessons if handled correctly. The importance of ethical action, patience, and composure under pressure had been highlighted clearly. He understood that leadership required more than authority. It required guiding others, teaching by example, and ensuring that systems supported fairness, accountability. The days after the incident at the checkpoint passed slowly but purposefully. The city continued its usual rhythm. Streets were busy, markets were alive with chatter, and cars moved steadily through the intersections. Yet the memory of what had happened remained vivid in the minds of many. The confrontation between the police officer and the Lieutenant General had left a mark, and its effects were still being felt across the department, the community, and even within the individuals involved. Inside the police department, the internal review reached its conclusion. The officer who had pointed his weapon and used offensive language faced the consequences of his actions. After thorough deliberation, it was decided that he would be terminated from his position. The decision was not taken lightly. Senior officials considered every detail: the videos, eyewitness accounts, body cam footage, and the officer's own statements. It was clear that his actions had violated protocol, endangered lives, and demonstrated a bias that could not be tolerated. Termination was the necessary step to restore trust and demonstrate accountability. The officer accepted the decision with a mix of resignation and regret. He understood fully that one moment of reckless behavior had changed everything. His career, reputation, and the trust others had placed in him were all lost. The realization was heavy, but it also brought clarity. He recognized that leadership, professionalism, and accountability were responsibilities that could never be taken lightly. This was a lesson written not just in words but in consequences that could not be reversed. Meanwhile, the Lieutenant General continued his visits to various government facilities and public offices. He remained calm, focused, and intentional in every interaction. Though the incident had been intense and potentially dangerous, it had reinforced his understanding of leadership and responsibility. Every day he spoke about integrity, ethical decision-making, and composure under pressure. He emphasized that courage alone was not enough. It needed to be paired with fairness, awareness, and ethical action. His calm presence became a model for those around him, inspiring respect and reflection. Within the department, broader reforms were set in motion. Training sessions were organized to teach officers how to handle stressful situations without resorting to aggression or bias. Officers were educated about the importance of empathy, proper communication, and ethical judgment. Policies were reviewed and strengthened to ensure that no similar incident could occur in the future. It was a moment of learning for the entire force, a reminder that professionalism and integrity must guide every decision. The community continued to engage with the story. People discussed the importance of accountability and fairness in law enforcement. Some reflected on the danger of prejudice and the need for awareness in positions of power. Others focused on the example of the Lieutenant General, noting how composure and calmness could prevent escalation and even save lives. The incident became a point of reference for discussions in homes, schools, civic organizations, and online spaces. It was no longer just a local story. It had become a lesson in ethics, leadership, and human responsibility. Witnesses who had captured the confrontation on their phones were invited to speak with community organizations and educational institutions. Their perspective helped others understand the importance of observation, responsibility, and action in moments of crisis. They shared how they felt during the confrontation, the fear, the tension, and the relief when the Lieutenant General remained calm. Their stories reinforced the message that courage, awareness, and integrity could make a significant difference in any situation. The terminated officer reflected on his own mistakes in solitude. He thought about how easily anger, fear, or prejudice could influence decisions. He realized that authority is a privilege that comes with responsibility, and that reckless actions could endanger others and destroy trust. This awareness was painful but necessary. For the first time, he considered what it truly meant to act with integrity, respect, and awareness of consequences. Though his path forward was uncertain, he now had a clearer understanding of what he had failed to uphold. At the same time, the Lieutenant General took time to meet with officers who had witnessed the incident. He spoke to them not with blame but with guidance. He emphasized the importance of professionalism, accountability, and composure. He reminded them that leadership could be demonstrated at every level, that actions mattered, and that ethical decisions were the foundation of trust. Officers were encouraged to reflect on their own behavior, learn from the incident, and ensure that they never allowed prejudice, fear, or anger to guide their actions. Public discussions about the event continued to highlight the lessons it offered. People debated how authority should be exercised, how to recognize and counter bias, and how to handle confrontation ethically. Schools and civic groups used the story to teach about respect, responsibility, and courage. Citizens reflected on how a single moment could have far-reaching consequences, and how calm, ethical leadership could guide people through even the most tense situations. The incident became a tool for reflection, education, and growth across the community. The department also reviewed policies related to conflict management, weapons handling, and community interaction. Officers were reminded that their responsibility was not only to enforce laws but also to maintain trust, act ethically, and prevent harm. Supervisors were trained to intervene appropriately and to ensure that bias or aggression did not go unchecked. These reforms were not temporary. They were designed to create lasting change, a culture of accountability, fairness, and professionalism within the force. Meanwhile, the Lieutenant General's calm demeanor and strategic approach continued to resonate. His actions had prevented what could have been a far more dangerous confrontation. By remaining composed and measured, he had protected lives, maintained professionalism, and set a standard for leadership. He reinforced the idea that true courage lies in restraint, ethical action, and careful decision-making, especially under pressure. His example became a benchmark for officers, officials, and citizens alike. As weeks passed, the city gradually returned to its usual rhythm, but the lessons from the incident remained alive. Conversations about ethics, accountability, and leadership were ongoing. Officers applied their training in real-life scenarios, learning to balance authority with integrity and composure. The public had seen how one person's actions could have ripple effects, both positive and negative. They had witnessed how courage, awareness, and calm could prevent harm, and how recklessness could create danger. These lessons were deeply ingrained in the community's consciousness. The terminated officer eventually left the department, carrying with him the heavy weight of his mistakes. He faced challenges in rebuilding his life and reputation, but he also carried an understanding of responsibility and accountability that he had lacked before. Though he could not undo his actions, the lessons he learned would shape his future decisions. It was a reminder that mistakes, while serious, could become powerful teachers if reflected upon honestly. The lieutenant general continued to lead with integrity, calm, and clarity. He visited other facilities, spoke with officials and officers, and ensured that systems were in place to prevent similar incidents. His focus remained on ethical leadership, transparency, and maintaining public trust. He understood that courage alone was not sufficient. Discipline, awareness, and moral responsibility were equally vital. His example continued to inspire others to act thoughtfully, ethically, and responsibly. The story of the incident became a lasting lesson for the city. It demonstrated how quickly tension could escalate, how prejudice and aggression could endanger lives, and how composure and integrity could prevent disaster. It also highlighted the importance of accountability, showing that actions have consequences and that no one is above the rules or the law. For citizens, officers, and leaders alike, it became a story about responsibility, ethical action, and courage guided by awareness. Community leaders, educators, and law enforcement officials continued to refer to the incident as a teaching moment. They emphasized the importance of empathy, fairness, and ethical judgment. Citizens discussed how to recognize bias, intervene safely, and support ethical leadership. It became clear that while the confrontation had been dangerous and shocking, it had also provided an opportunity for growth, reflection, and improvement across multiple levels of society. By the end of the month, the city had not forgotten the lessons of the incident. Officers had completed additional training. Policies had been revised, and the terminated officer had accepted the consequences of his actions. The lieutenant general's example of calm and ethical leadership remained central to public discussions. People reflected on the power of courage combined with integrity, and how ethical behavior could guide actions even in moments of extreme pressure. The story of that day became more than just a report of a confrontation. It became a narrative of accountability, courage, and learning. It showed how one person's reckless actions could create danger, but how the right response could prevent escalation and provide guidance. It demonstrated that leadership is not about aggression or fear, but about responsibility, ethics, and composure. The lessons were clear, enduring, and human.